to understand what's happening in the U.S. today requires that we not only see the reality of the internal policies being enacted, but the foreign policy that the U.S. is practicing. And one fantastic example of that is Venezuela, which is very hard to see accurately or understand from the U.S. for reasons that will become clear over this video. But doing our best to see through the miasma of propaganda and misdirection about that little country is absolutely necessary to understand what's happening both there and here. You should take anything any white person says about Venezuela with a large dose of salt, including me. My only qualification is being married to a brilliant Venezuelan with a fierce mind and a large community, which has put me in close contact with a lot of Venezuelans, from Chavistas to MAGA. I think I have enough perspective to make my voice worth your time on this, but my understanding is far from complete and changing all the time. And Venezuelans are not a monolith, so many will disagree with what I say here. Before we talk about Venezuela, though, we need to talk about something much more important. Venezuelans. The first thing to know is that throughout South, Central, and North America, Venezuelans in particular, far above all other nationalities, are the subject of absolutely wild racist scapegoating, insults, and attacks. It's impossible to overstate how denigrated they are. They are the brunt of the rest of Latin America in particular. This is commonly discussed by other Latine people who are not Venezuelan who have critical analysis and can see what's happening. Let me give you a personal example of what I'm talking about. During the last election cycle in Peru a few years ago, the Conservative Party was running on a campaign of racism. Conservative parties in the U.S. run on campaigns of racism against all Latine people. We know that when racists in the U.S. complain about Mexicans, they don't actually mean Mexicans in particular, they mean all brown Spanish-speaking people. This racist scapegoating is just as common in Latin American countries, but it is genuinely specific and almost always against Venezuelans. If you took a Republican speech full of thinly veiled racism and translated it to Spanish and replaced the words Mexicans and immigrants with the word Venezuelans, that would be exactly what the Peruvian conservatives are saying. Crime is high, it's Venezuelans. You don't have a job, it's the Venezuelans. Pay is low, it's the Venezuelans. The poor parts of Lima are rough, and this well-funded racism led to a severe escalation of physical attacks against Venezuelans in Lima. I know this because my brother, my wife's brother, lived there at the time. He'd lived there for many years, happily making knockoff phone cables, and during that campaign, one of his Venezuelan friends was targeted, attacked, and lost his life for being Venezuelan. This really shook him. Then the same thing happened to another of his Venezuelan friends. And then another. So he packed up his life and hiked from Lima to Texas, hiked the Darien Gap, sustained things that I can't describe on here and shouldn't without hardcore trigger warnings, to turn himself in at the U.S. border. All that because he was afraid he would lose his life walking down the street in Lima because he's Venezuelan. Peru is not an exception, it's the norm. Venezuelan refugees are treated like absolute trash everywhere they go, from Brazil to Mexico, Texas to Canada. I could give anecdotes for hours. When I was in Vancouver a few years ago, I was talking to an old Mexican lady. She asked why I spoke Spanish. I told her my wife's Venezuelan, and without missing a beat, she started just going off about how lazy and worthless Venezuelans are, how they shouldn't be allowed anywhere, how Venezuelans are lying scumbags, they give other immigrants a bad name. Bear in mind, this was her response to hearing that I am married to a Venezuelan. It was wild, and that's every day for Venezuelans. Colombia treats them like garbage. Mexico, brutal for Venezuelans. And we all hear how the U.S. targets and treats them specifically. They're just the absolute scapegoat throughout the Americas. A few weeks ago, the U.S. blew up a boat that they claimed they thought was full of Venezuelans. And it turned out it was full of Colombians. The U.S. and Colombia gave a joint, heartfelt apology, and the whole tone of it was this: hey, so we blew up this boat because we thought it was Venezuelans, but it turns out it was actual people. We're so deeply sorry. We weren't trying to hurt any people. Why? Why are Venezuelans in particular so denigrated and so targeted throughout all of the Americas? Well, this is where we go from talking about Venezuelans to Venezuela. A couple of decades ago, Venezuela as a whole had the absolute audacity to oppose the U.S. empire by electing Hugo Chavez. He was complicated, but there's a few things we can say undeniably. The first is that, like most socialists, he immediately provided a ton of funding to schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. He invested in his country, and things got undeniably better. Health rates went up, reading rate went up, pay went up, everything. The second, which is related, is that he refused to bend the knee to the U.S. empire. In this case, that meant he did not allow unchecked U.S. exploitation of Venezuelan oil and gas reserves. Instead, he nationalized the oil fields and started selling it on the open market, largely to Russia and China. The U.S. was absolutely furious and instituted a series of brutal sanctions, embargoes, blockades, all sorts of things which have only escalated to this day. So much for free trade. When the U.S. empire says free trade to another country, what they mean is, you give us all your resources or we blow you to the Stone Age. This made things very hard for Venezuelans. Then Chavez passed, and they elected Maduro because he was as close as they thought they could get to Chavez. Maduro is objectively not as cool. There's a lot to critique about him. My brother is very clear that if he ever sets foot in Venezuela again, he'll be immediately arrested as an imperial infiltrator. Every other Venezuelan I know, from all political stripes, agrees. That's not great. There's definitely tones of authoritarianism in Maduro's regime, though I'll come back to it in a minute. Hold on before you pass too much judgment. And for reference, the U.S. is actively funding Saudi Arabia, Qatar is not real, and a dozen other countries who perpetrate human rights violations and fund terror 1,000,000 times worse than anything happening in Venezuela. So the idea that the U.S. cares about human rights is laughable. The difference is that Saudi Arabia is willing to play ball with U.S. empire, and Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro is not. So the U.S. has been doing what it does, use its military to crush free trade and terrorize a tiny nation into giving up its natural resources and selling itself into serfdom. So far, Venezuela has refused to bend the knee, so the U.S. empire has been cranking up the heat for decades. The U.S. sanctions and embargoes have made things very, very hard there. And that has created a refugee crisis from Venezuela. I'm not saying Maduro is good, though he's certainly nowhere near as cartoonishly evil as the U.S. works to paint him, just like Muammar Gaddafi was a complex person who the U.S. painted as the paragon of evil because he opposed U.S. empire. I'll make a prediction. My prediction is this. In 50 years, if there is still any U.S. government left to identify, and if the Freedom of Information Act still stands, we will learn that the CIA has been funding anti-Venezuelan propaganda throughout South and Central America for decades. This is the kind of thing the U.S. does, and far worse. Do you remember when the CIA overthrew that democratically elected leader and installed a brutal U.S. corporate-controlled dictator in that Latin American country for U.S. financial gain? Do you know that there's at least half a dozen events that I just described, from Chile to Guatemala? The entire U.S. economy is built on economic terrorism against Latin America and the rest of the world. The U.S. putting a finger on the scales of racist propaganda in Latin America in order to increase pressure on Venezuela to bend the knee would be tame compared to what we know they did and do. On this note, the Nobel Peace Prize was just given to the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, for her tireless efforts to democratize and liberate Venezuela. Maria Corina Machado is working for the CIA. She is 100% a tool of U.S. empire. This is her with Edmundo González Urrutia, who she worked for and backed in the last election. Urrutia worked under Reagan for the Condor Plan and then Operation Centaur, two notorious CIA schemes to destroy El Salvador, which cost the lives of at least tens of thousands of community organizers and radical priests who were working for the people, and destabilized El Salvador to the point where it is where the U.S. outsources prison camps to now. It's hard to describe how deeply evil these people are, including Maria Corina Machado. They're simply drenched in blood. So why did the West give her a Nobel Peace Prize? Well, because like Chavez's government, Maduro's continues to refuse to bend the knee to the U.S. empire. So they need to glorify and elevate the opposition to him, regardless of who they are. Maria Machado openly supports the most horrifying human rights violations happening around the world today, from the Middle East to Latin America. She says she wants the U.S. to continue doing what it's doing in Latin America. Let's be crystal clear. Any Latin American politician who says they want the U.S. to continue doing what it's doing in Latin America is working for the U.S. government, period. The nominal reason for this round of escalations against Venezuela is to try and reduce the drug trade. The fact that the U.S. can still say that they want to reduce drug trade in Latin America without everyone, every reporter and everyone listening laughing in their faces is incredible. The reason the drug trade exists in Latin America is because the U.S. funded it with billions of dollars over the last century. The U.S. built the drug trade brick by brick as a weapon It's a double-edged sword. One side is against black people specifically and poor people in general in the U.S. in order to sell poor people and black people into slavery in the prison industrial complex and prevent us from voting. The other side of that sword is a ready-made excuse to invade any country who isn't bending the knee to the U.S. Oh, Guatemalan workers want to be paid more than a penny a day for brutal labor picking bananas? Looks like Guatemala suddenly developed a very serious drug problem that the U.S., in its ethical integrity, just has to intervene with. Oops! While the U.S. was there solving the drug problem, they accidentally gave the entire country to Chiquita Corporation and sold all the Guatemalan workers into slavery. And now there's more drugs than ever. What a funny little slip up. Haha, we'll do better next time, we promise. Just keep paying us your tax dollars. The number of times this has been done with the exact same rhetoric boggles the mind. The U.S. is the largest, most dangerous drug cartel on the planet by orders of magnitude. So we know the drug story the U.S. is spinning is complete nonsense. Let's talk about why the U.S. is actually moving now. Remember, this is speculation from a redneck biology teacher. But here's some points to hold in mind. About a decade ago, massive oil reserves were discovered off the coast of Guyana, Venezuela's neighbor to the south. Since then, under Maduro, something's been happening. What's been happening depends on who you ask. If you ask most Venezuelans, then Venezuela is working to reclaim land that was stolen from them by the European colonial powers when they cut up that part of the world into their arbitrary states and drew borders in Latin America. If you ask most Guyanans or the U.S., then Venezuela has been making military incursions into Guyana to try and steal territory through military force. So it's either a land back movement with teeth or petty imperial land theft, depending on who you ask. The truth is that it's messy, and there's not a clear answer. This is definitely not just some healthy, empowered indigenous land back movement, and it's also not just some petty imperial land theft. It's complicated. On this note, remember how my brother would be incarcerated if he ever went home? Sounds bad, right? Well, to really understand that, we have to understand how brutal and insidious the U.S. is. The U.S. doesn't just fund the entire opposition to Maduro's government and control them as puppets of empire. They also fund paramilitaries from Colombia to cross the border and incite civil violence at protests. My wife's father talks about how at every protest in Caracas, there are crowds of Colombians in combat boots trying to rile up violence and start fights with the police in order to get the pictures and video, the media, of what then looks like popular unrest against Maduro's government. The takeaway here isn't that the cops are the good guys. Venezuelan police are notoriously corrupt and tied to gang violence, as is Maduro. The point is that it is not clear. So Maduro is right to be concerned about U.S. infiltration. My wife said this morning, do you have any idea how paranoid I'd be if I were Maduro? I wouldn't do things the way he's doing them, but I understand how he feels. So nothing is simple in Venezuela. It's muddy, and to see clearly, we must hold these layers of nuance. With that in mind, back to Venezuela's incursions into Guyana. It's been happening for a while now, but it's escalated over the last 5 years. Oil is the core of Venezuela's economy, and they've been drilling aggressively for a long time. There's still a lot there. They hold some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, but they want more. Or they want the U.S. not to gain more. Guyana sold the rights to their oil to U.S. corporations, Chevron and ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil uses billions in U.S. taxpayer subsidies to probe and drill there today. So the U.S. is already deeply invested in Guyana's oil reserves for corporate profit. Venezuela has nationalized oil. So the profits go to Venezuela, not to private corporations. So there's a couple possible futures here. One is that Venezuela invades Guyana and nationalizes their oil reserves, effectively removing it from U.S. corporate control. Another is that the U.S. threatens Venezuela enough to get them to back off Guyana, and things stay pretty much as they are, except for whatever extrajudicial crimes the U.S. commits along the way, which is just another Tuesday in Latin America. If the U.S. overthrows Maduro, things will go very poorly for Venezuela and Venezuelans. Look up what happened when the U.S. overthrew the democratically elected leader of Chile, Salvador Allende. They installed Augusto Pinochet, one of the most notorious dictators in Latin American history. That's what Venezuela is at risk of today. Another point about Maduro, for your awareness, he is currently arming all of the citizens of Venezuela in preparation for a U.S. invasion. And the Venezuelans are on board. A lot of Venezuelans are signing up to defend their land. It's not the kind of thing that dictators do. Dictators typically want to disarm their populations like Trump is doing in the U.S. right now. passing a bunch of laws that allow political disarmament of the people who he's concerned about. For better or worse, Maduro seems to have close ties to Venezuelan gangs and cartels. Gangs in Venezuela are not like gangs in the U.S. They have like a lot of helicopters and RPGs, and they use them. While the idea of a government being linked that closely to gangs sounds bad, remember that nothing in Venezuela is simple. We may be about to witness one of the first times that gangs actively take part in defending a country from imperial invasion. Interestingly, this is a direct parallel to how the gangs of Chicago and LA are currently some of the only groups openly opposing the horrifying violence happening in the US today. Does this mean that the gangs were secretly good all along? No, of course not. It just means that reality is complicated, and those we're taught to see as enemies are not always acting in bad faith. Another quote from my wife. There's not a dictatorship in Venezuela, but there's certainly patriarchy. The gangs there are brutal. The levels of lateral violence are high. The fact that that is largely a result of U.S. imperial violence in the form of sanctions and embargoes doesn't change the fact that life is hard there. Finally, it's noteworthy that the current type of government in the U.S. is highly unstable. The brutal violence and exploitation that the current regime is practicing in the U.S. are so counter to human health and wellness that they simply can't last anywhere. Couldn't last in Germany, couldn't last in Chile, can't last here. The people profiteering off of this violence know this, and they plan for it. Their plan is not to be here as this country burns from all the fires they're lighting. Their plan is to make unimaginable amounts of money and then hide as everything collapses. And they make plans for how to escape when accountability comes calling. Those escape plans are called rat lines. When Germany fell, the U.S. welcomed many fleeing rats with open arms. There's a whole thing, Operation Paperclip. They welcomed a lot of rats. And they've been feeding and breeding those rats here ever since. Argentina also welcomed a lot of rats, and they're preparing to do so again. It's no accident that Trump just gave Argentina $20 billion. He's buying a rat line to escape his victims and accountability. If he can overthrow Venezuela and steal all of Guyana's oil at the same time, that's a great rat line for him. Back to Venezuelans. They're not a monolith. Like I said, I have Venezuelan family who are Chavistas and Venezuelan family who are full MAGA. The one thing that they have in common is being universally treated like shit everywhere they go. So regardless of the political opinions of any Venezuelan you meet, just remember that their family, and potentially they personally, have lived through things you can't imagine if you're from the US. They are being actively targeted above everyone else in multiple countries, and they have literally nowhere to go. There are no countries that welcome Venezuelans. I know a fair number of people who hiked the Darien Gap, and they all say that traveling through Mexico was the worst part of that trip because of the brutal racism and exploitation they faced there. So wherever you are, if you meet a traveling Venezuelan, maybe just take a minute to consider. If my entire life and country were destroyed by a foreign empire, and I had to flee with just what I could carry, and there was literally not a single place in the world that would welcome me because the foreign empire that destroyed my home funded global propaganda to make me a pariah, how would I hope people might treat me? If that was my daughter going through that, how might I hope people would treat her? The only thing Venezuelans did wrong was have the heart and bravery to stand up against the systems that are literally ending the world today. That, combined with the fact that they hold some of the largest oil reserves in the world, is why the US is targeting them now.